Welcome aboard Rocket Ship, the platform with the most relevant content for competitive examinations. This is Rocket Ship IAS Lab and continuing with a series on answer writing for general studies papers of civil service main examination. We take up a question that you might come across in GS paper 3. Let us read out the question carefully. It is human interference with nature that turns a hazard into a disaster. Actually, this is a concept that is very important in disaster management, that it is human action that turns a hazard. A hazard is actually a probabilistic, you could say, term. That is, when we are talking about hazard, we are essentially talking of the probability of some, you could say, accident happening. That is a hazard. But it is the human action that turns a hazard into a disaster. As you can see, this is the classic contemplative, or for that matter reflective type of questions that sometimes UPSC throws you away. And this question, it requires you to think on this point, that it is human actions, or rather how it is human action that turns a hazard into a disaster. You can understand this, you could say, subtle difference between these two terms, that hazard is vulnerability, but a disaster is its, you could say, result. It's actual happening when it leads to loss of a great deal of lives as well as property, then it is called a disaster. So this was the nub of the argument, that how it is human hand which turns a hazard into a disaster. And you have to discuss this point with reference to the, you could say, occurrences, the repeating occurrences of landslides in India. We are introducing our answer with a piece of, you could say, current affairs, that is an instrument, actually a tool that has been built by ISRO, which is called the Landslides Atlas of India, which was brought out by ISRO's National Remote Sensing Center. Had some sobering statistics. Sobering means something that would put you to thinking. India is among the top 5 countries most affected by landslides. Uttarakhand, Mizoram and Kerala are states most vulnerable to landslides. Actually, it is a different order here. Mizoram is most vulnerable to landslides, but after that comes Uttarakhand and then comes Kerala. Most of the northeast except Assam, the sub-Himalayan zone including Jammu and Kashmir, Ladakh and Himachal Pradesh, we have already talked about Uttarakhand, and Maharashtra apart from Kerala in the Western Ghats, are some of the areas recording most landslides in India. Now the point is that India's geography and climate indeed make it vulnerable to landslides. Young mountains with unconsolidated mass, as is typical of Himalayan orogeny, that is Himalayan mountain building process, and the climatic rhythm exemplified by monsoon, where a few months see torrential rains. These create a perfect recipe for landslides. So the essential point we are driving here is that India is vulnerable to landslides due to the nature of its geography and climate. It is vulnerable to landslides. But now we are introducing this point, that it is the human role that aggravates a hazard into a disaster, and we would discuss it in with a special reference to landslides. How is it that it is the human hand that turns a hazard into a disaster of landslide? First is disregarding the carrying capacity of the slope. For an example, due to haphazard construction, unplanned urbanization and infrastructure building, etc. Here we actually disregard the carrying capacity of the slope. It is actually a very important concept the carrying capacity of the slope can be called its load bearing capacity. That is a particular slope due to its nature. For an example, it's, you could say, its morphology, geomorphology, for that is which rock, what kind of rock or what kind of soil it has, or for that matter how steep it is. Due to these reasons, every slope has its particular carrying capacity, its particular load bearing capacity. And when human action exceeds this carrying capacity, that is, we put more load than the slope can actually bear, it would lead to a landslide today or tomorrow. That is the point we are making here. Then comes hubristic disrespect. Hubristic means human ego, actually, human conceit actually, for nature. For example, toe cutting the slope or hydropower dams, reservoirs, etc. All of these things, which are often, you could say, a byproduct of human greed too, all of these would lead to landslide, as we would discuss later. Then comes this perennial problem of deforestation. How deforestation can lead to landslides? It can actually feed into landslides, that it removes plants whose roots, actually it is tree roots which hold the soil. You can understand very well that the tree roots, they grip into the soil. In that manner they consolidate the soil and prevent landslides. Similarly, splash erosion, which all adds to debris. What actually splash erosion means, when there is rainfall, the force of the rainfall would actually lead to some form of erosion of the soil. This is called splash erosion. And when foliage is present, that is when vegetation is present, its leaves, its foliage actually acts as some form of break, that it would break the force of the raindrops, and in that manner it would prevent a splash erosion. And when we denude the slope, when we actually deforest the slope, there would be nothing left to prevent this splash erosion, and this would add to the actual debris on the slope. In that way, deforestation would lead to aggravating the problem of landslides. Then intensive farming over traditional methods like contour farming, or for that matter terrace farming. Actually these traditional ways of farming, which were more suited to the local geomorphology or local climate, has been replaced by intensive farming. And this thing actually replacing the traditional and in fact the more wiser ways of farming with intensive farming would lead to landslide. Taking up these points in detail, there is a limit how much load a slope can take. This depends on factors like steepness of the slope, soil or rock type, local climate conditions, etc. But humans disregard this carrying capacity of the slope for building commercial and tourist infrastructure, physical infrastructure, or side effect of unplanned haphazard urbanization. This fact was driven home by the tragic Mumbai landslides of 2021, in which more than 24 people lost their lives. Again, actually, the point here is when you are taking up these kinds of questions, for example, natural disasters and all those, please try to include some of the, you could say, actual events, some of the actual accidents from current affairs. And actually, what we are actually discussing here, that it is Mumbai's, you could say, topography that is prone to landslides. But due to unchecked urbanization, this problem of landslides, this vulnerability to landslides, has actually turned into a disaster that was seen during the year 2021, when more than 24 people lost their lives in the vicinity of the metropolitan city of Mumbai. Then nature's unremitting forces like adverse weather phenomena encounter man's greed. Dams usually built in high mountains zone can saturate the soil with groundwater. Actually, when we build reservoirs in the high mountains, some of the water would seep into the slope, and this would actually make the slope more vulnerable to landslides. This makes the slope prone to landslide. Tapovan Vishnugad hydel power project has been blamed for the subsidence that has endangered the spiritually and historically significant point of Joshimath. Another point that you should actually give some attention to, that any disaster, or for that matter landslide, or for that matter any other disaster, this not only leads to loss of human or animal lives, many a times it's loss of something more, you could say, intangible. For example, the historical and spiritual tradition of Joshimath, that is traced back to Adi Sankaracharya himself. If the town of Joshimath were to be lost, unfortunately we are making this, you could say, quite, you could say, demonical prophecy, that the town of Joshimath is likely to be lost due to land subsidence and landslide. And if that were to happen, we would lose not only a town and its people, but we would lose something much more important. That is the historical and spiritual tradition of a place that is quite unique and that is of great significance. Now, as we were talking about deforestation, deforestation directly makes a slope susceptible to landslides. Tree roots hold the slope together as they consolidate the soil. Foliage breaks the force of raindrops and mitigates splash erosion, as we were talking about. Moreover, when the slope is denuded, nothing is there to break the force of a landslide. Actually, old growth trees, large old growth trees would act as some form of break to the landslide. But when we are cutting off all these trees, when we have deforested the slope, there would be nothing to, you could say, stop this landslide. Now, another point is, in the name of modernity, we have cast away the traditional practices accumulated over generations. This wisdom was in harmony with nature, best adapted to local environmental conditions. Practices like contour farming, terrace farming have been discarded for intensive farming. Contour farming is actually a practice where you build along the slope rather than building horizontally, as is the custom on plain land. You build along the slope. For example, you build a farm along the slope, you plant crops along the slope, which is called contour farming. And terrace farming, as you can understand, terrace farming is is analogous to a staircase where you build your farms on different levels. And all these traditional practices had this effect of that they were more in sync, more in harmony with the local conditions. Unfortunately, all these practices have been replaced with something, you could say, quite mechanical, intensive farming. This has been implicated in disasters like the deadly Wayanad disasters, the Wayanad landslides of 2024. That recorded a toll of that took away the lives of more than 400 human beings, many major injuries, and caused much misery, leaving people traumatized. Actually, this was the same case with the like the Raigad landslides of a few years ago, where too the intensive farming practice was blamed for causing this landslide. And now, to sum up, we are making some suggestions that we must stopping landslides, or for that matter preventing other disasters, would entail respecting nature and the limits imposed by it. That essentially we are referring to the carrying capacity of the slope in that matter, that it is a limit that is imposed by nature and we must respect it. We should also recognize the wisdom of traditional practices more adapted to local conditions. The best practices like contour farming, terrace farming, and so on. This wisdom should be promoted. Again, first it should be promoted through various incentives. It should be shared widely or disseminated. Moreover, human greed will have to be kept in check through law and its, you could say, enforcement. And that is, to give you just one example, we must stop deforestation through using the, you could say, legal provisions. So this was the point that we were making, that it is again the human action that would lead to a hazard, a vulnerability turning into a disaster. We have discussed this point with a special reference to landslides happening in India. This was all for today. We would bring you another lecture in a few days. As usual, we wish you all the best. Thank you.